There is something a narcissist fears more than being criticized, more than being exposed, more than being ignored, and most people never realize what it is. Because it isn't power, it isn't revenge, it isn't manipulation. It's something far simpler, a person they can no longer control. For years, the narcissist survives by understanding one thing better than most people: human reactions. They learn which words create guilt, which behaviors create confusion, which tactics create dependency, and over time they become incredibly skilled at influencing the emotions of others, especially empathetic people. In fact, empaths often become the perfect target, not because they're weak, because they care. They want to understand, they want to help, they want to see the good in people. The narcissist quickly notices this. While others see kindness, the narcissist sees opportunity. While others see compassion, the narcissist sees access. And for a while, the dynamic works exactly the way the narcissist wants. The empath gives. The narcissist takes. The empath forgives. The narcissist repeats. The empath explains. The narcissist avoids accountability. Round and round the cycle goes, until something unexpected happens. The empath evolves. Not every empath reaches this stage. Many remain trapped in the cycle for years, sometimes decades, but eventually some empaths experience a transformation so profound that it completely changes the balance of power. This is what many people call the super empath. Not because they have supernatural abilities, not because they're perfect, but because they have combined empathy with awareness, compassion with boundaries, kindness with strength. And once that happens, the narcissist faces a problem they are rarely prepared for. The same empathy they once exploited becomes impossible to control. At first, the narcissist doesn't notice the change. Why would they? The empath still appears kind, still appears patient, still appears understanding. On the surface, everything looks familiar. But beneath the surface, something is very different. The empath is watching, not reacting, observing, not absorbing, learning, not excusing. For the first time, they're paying attention to patterns instead of promises. And patterns tell a story words cannot hide. The narcissist says one thing, then does another. Makes promises, breaks promises, creates problems, avoids responsibility. The empath begins connecting the dots. The excuses that once sounded believable no longer make sense. The apologies that once felt sincere begin feeling repetitive. The confusion that once kept them trapped starts disappearing. And clarity is dangerous to manipulation, because manipulation requires confusion. The moment confusion fades, control begins fading too. This is usually the first thing that unsettles the narcissist. The empath is no longer reacting the same way. The guilt trips don't work. The emotional pressure doesn't work. The silent treatments don't work. The narcissist pulls a familiar lever expecting a familiar result. Nothing happens, and that is deeply uncomfortable, because narcissists become accustomed to predictable emotional responses. They expect guilt, fear, anxiety, desperation. When those responses disappear, they lose one of their most valuable tools, the ability to influence behavior through emotional pressure. What makes this especially frustrating for the narcissist is that the super empath doesn't usually fight back aggressively. They don't need to. The narcissist is prepared for arguments, prepared for emotional reactions, prepared for drama. What they're not prepared for is calm awareness. Imagine spending years using the same key to open a door. Then one day the key stops working. Not because the door disappeared, because the lock changed. That's exactly what happens. The narcissist continues using old tactics. The empath responds differently. The familiar cycle begins breaking. And whenever a toxic cycle breaks, panic often follows. Because the narcissist starts sensing something. They're losing influence. Not all at once. Gradually. The super empath stops explaining themselves endlessly, stops defending every decision, stops seeking approval, stops chasing validation, and these changes create enormous discomfort. Why? Because narcissistic control often depends on emotional engagement. As long as the empath keeps arguing, they're still invested. As long as they keep explaining, they're still participating. As long as they keep trying to be understood, they're still attached to the outcome. But when the super empath begins letting go of those needs, the narcissist loses access to the emotional energy they once relied upon. This is where things become fascinating. Most people assume a narcissist wants admiration, and often they do. But what many people don't understand is that attention itself becomes a form of fuel. Positive attention, negative attention. It doesn't always matter. What matters is influence, impact, significance, the ability to create reactions, the ability to occupy emotional space in another person's mind. The super empath slowly removes that fuel source, not through cruelty, through detachment. And detachment can be incredibly unsettling for someone who depends on emotional control. The narcissist starts noticing the empath no longer chases conversations, no longer begs for understanding, no longer fights to keep the relationship alive at any cost. The desperation is gone, the fear is gone, the dependency is gone. For perhaps the first time, the empath looks emotionally free, and freedom is difficult to control. This is often when the narcissist begins escalating behavior, not because they're evil masterminds, because their usual strategies aren't producing results. People tend to increase behaviors that once worked. If guilt worked before, they'll use more guilt. If criticism worked before, they'll use more criticism. If silence worked before, they'll become even more distant. But the super empath now sees these behaviors for what they are: patterns, predictable patterns, and once you recognize a pattern, it loses much of its power. Think about a magician. The illusion is impressive until you discover how the trick works. Once you understand the mechanism, the mystery disappears. The same thing happens here. The empath starts recognizing manipulation in real time. The emotional fog clears, the confusion weakens, the reality becomes visible, and that reality changes everything. One of the hardest things for a narcissist to face is accountability. Not because accountability is impossible, because accountability requires self-reflection, and self-reflection can threaten the identity they've spent years protecting. The super empath unintentionally creates this pressure, not through accusations, not through attacks, simply through refusing to participate in unhealthy dynamics. The empath no longer rescues, no longer fixes, no longer absorbs consequences that belong to someone else. For years, they carried responsibilities that weren't theirs. Now they put them down, and suddenly the narcissist is left standing face to face with problems they previously avoided. That experience feels uncomfortable, sometimes extremely uncomfortable, because without someone constantly cushioning reality, reality hits harder. This is where many people misunderstand the phrase, "a super empath tortures a narcissist." The super empath isn't usually plotting revenge. They're not trying to cause suffering. The real discomfort comes from something much simpler. The narcissist can no longer access the version of the empath they once controlled. The old version is gone. The version that tolerated endless excuses, gone. The version that accepted emotional breadcrumbs, gone. The version that abandoned themselves to keep the peace, gone. And that loss feels significant, because the narcissist isn't losing an argument. They're losing influence. They're losing predictability. They're losing access to a familiar source of emotional control. For someone who has spent years depending on those things, the experience can feel overwhelming. But the most powerful part hasn't happened yet, because the super empath eventually reaches a stage that changes the entire dynamic. A stage where they stop focusing on the narcissist altogether. And that is the moment everything truly begins to shift. Because the greatest shock isn't that the empath became stronger. The greatest shock is what happens when the empath finally realizes their energy was never meant to be spent managing someone else's behavior. It was meant to be invested in their own life, their own healing, their own future. And once that realization fully takes hold, The narcissist finds themselves facing something they rarely encounter. Someone who understands exactly who they are and no longer feels the need to fight them. Someone who sees the game clearly and simply chooses not to play. And for a person who spent years depending on reactions, control, and emotional influence, there are few experiences more unsettling than that. Because the super empath's greatest power was never revenge, it was freedom. And freedom is something no narcissist can control. That is where the story truly changes. Because most people assume the biggest victory is exposing the narcissist, proving them wrong, getting revenge, making them feel the same pain they caused. But the super empath eventually discovers something unexpected. The moment they stop trying to win against the narcissist is the moment they actually win. For years, the narcissist occupied space inside their mind. Every conversation was analyzed. Every mixed signal was examined. Every criticism was questioned. Every emotional wound was revisited. The empath spent enormous amounts of energy trying to understand what was happening, trying to solve the puzzle, trying to make sense of behavior that often made no sense. But eventually, a realization arrives, a realization that changes everything. Not every puzzle is meant to be solved. Some puzzles are meant to be left behind. The super empath begins understanding that endless analysis is still a form of attachment. Constantly thinking about the narcissist keeps the narcissist emotionally relevant, even when the thoughts are negative, even when the focus is on healing. Attention is still attention. Energy is still energy. And the super empath starts asking a powerful question. What would happen if I stopped giving this person so much of my mental space? At first, the answer feels uncomfortable, because letting go can feel like surrender, especially after investing so much, especially after caring so deeply, especially after spending years trying to fix what could not be fixed. But slowly, the empath discovers something. Letting go is not surrender. It's liberation, and liberation changes behavior. The super empath stops monitoring, stops chasing closure, stops seeking explanations, stops waiting for accountability. Not because accountability no longer matters, because their peace matters more. This is where the narcissist often becomes confused, very confused, because they are accustomed to occupying center stage, accustomed to being emotionally significant, accustomed to influencing reactions. But suddenly the empath's attention starts moving elsewhere, toward goals, toward healing, toward friendships, toward purpose, toward personal growth. The emotional spotlight begins shifting away. And for someone who relied on being the center of attention, that shift can feel unsettling. The narcissist may try old strategies. A message appears unexpectedly, a sudden apology, a nostalgic memory, a crisis, a dramatic story, something designed to reopen the emotional connection. And sometimes these tactics work, at least temporarily. But the super empath is no longer the same person. They have learned something through pain. Patterns matter more than promises. Consistency matters more than words. Actions matter more than intentions. This lesson becomes their shield. The empath no longer evaluates people based on potential. They evaluate people based on behavior, and behavior tells the truth. The narcissist may promise change. The super empath watches actions. The narcissist may create emotional pressure. The super empath watches patterns. The narcissist may attempt to rewrite history. The super empath trusts reality. This shift removes one of the narcissist's greatest advantages: confusion. Because confusion is fertile ground for manipulation. Clarity is not. The clearer the empath becomes, the less influence the narcissist has. And that is where a fascinating psychological reversal occurs. For years, the empath doubted themselves, doubted their perceptions, doubted their instincts, doubted their decisions. Now the opposite begins happening. The empath starts trusting themselves again. Their intuition returns, their confidence returns, their self-respect returns. And self-respect changes everything. A person with low self-respect is easier to manipulate. A person with strong self-respect becomes much harder to control, because boundaries become stronger, Standards become clearer. Tolerance becomes healthier. The super empath no longer feels obligated to explain every decision, no longer feels obligated to justify every boundary, no longer feels obligated to convince others that their feelings matter. They simply act accordingly. And this quiet confidence can be incredibly frustrating to someone who previously benefited from self-doubt, because self-doubt creates openings. Confidence closes them. One of the biggest misconceptions about the super empath is that they become cold. They don't, at least not in the way people imagine. They still care deeply, still love deeply, still feel deeply. The difference is that they have stopped confusing compassion with self-sacrifice. That distinction is life-changing. For years, they believed helping meant enduring. They believed understanding meant tolerating. They believed love meant staying no matter what. Now they understand differently. Love without respect is unhealthy. Compassion without boundaries is dangerous. Understanding without accountability is incomplete. These lessons become permanent, and once learned, they are difficult to forget. The narcissist often senses this change, not necessarily through words, through energy, through behavior, through the absence of old reactions. The empath is no longer emotionally available in the same way, no longer endlessly accessible, no longer willing to participate in unhealthy cycles. The familiar dynamic is gone, and that's what creates the discomfort. Not punishment, not revenge, loss of access, loss of influence, loss of control. This is why the phrase, "the super empath tortures the narcissist," is often misunderstood. The super empath is not actively trying to create suffering. The discomfort comes from consequences, consequences that can no longer be avoided. For years, the empath softened reality, absorbed blame, made excuses, provided endless opportunities. Now reality stands on its own, and reality can be difficult to face, especially when someone has spent years avoiding it. But the most powerful transformation isn't happening inside the narcissist. It's happening inside the empath. Because for the first time in a very long time, their life is no longer organized around someone else's behavior. Think about how much energy many empaths spend anticipating moods, managing emotions, preventing conflicts, keeping relationships stable, monitoring situations, trying to create harmony. It's exhausting. When that responsibility finally disappears, something remarkable happens. The empath gets their life back. Their attention returns. Their creativity returns. Their peace returns. Their sense of identity returns. They remember who they were before the emotional chaos consumed so much of their energy. And this is often the stage where outsiders notice the biggest difference. The empath seems lighter, stronger, calmer, more confident. Not because life has become perfect, because they are no longer carrying what was never theirs to carry. That freedom radiates outward. People can feel it. The narcissist can feel it too. The person who once seemed dependent now seems independent. The person who once sought validation now validates themselves. The person who once feared losing the relationship now values their peace more than keeping it. And that transformation is powerful. Not because it hurts the narcissist, because it heals the empath. That is the part many people miss. The true victory was never about making the narcissist suffer. The true victory was ending your own suffering. The true victory was reclaiming your energy, reclaiming your identity, reclaiming your future. And once the super empath understands that, they stop measuring success by what happens to the narcissist. They start measuring success by what happens to themselves, their growth, their healing, their happiness, their freedom. Because in the end, the most powerful thing a super empath can do is not destroy the narcissist. It's refuse to destroy themselves anymore. It's choosing peace over chaos, truth over confusion, self-respect over approval, and freedom over control. That is the transformation the narcissist never expects. Not because the empath became stronger than them, because the empath finally stopped giving them the power to define their life. And when that happens, the game is over. Not because someone won, because the super empath finally walked off the board and started living for themselves.